Well, good morning. It's good to see you at Creek Sin today. If you're watching online, welcome as well. Happy New Year, everybody. How's the diet coming? That's what we all do, right? I've decided I'm going to open up a gym for 2 weeks in January, and then the rest of the time it's going to be a fast food restaurant. How about that? That's what happens, isn't it? Well, it's good to see you here today. A brand new year, first Sunday of the year, and my condolences to all Texans fans. My congratulations to Cowboy fans. We'll see what happens, all right? We're starting a brand new series today, and one of the reasons we're doing this particular series is because next Sunday is the Sunday we celebrate the day that we began as a church 15 years ago, the church at Creek Sin over at Klein Oak High School. But we're going to celebrate it all month. I mean, when we did our 10-year anniversary, we went back over to Klein Oak, and we had a big service and had a good fun with it. And we're not going to making that big a deal of it this time, but we are going to celebrate all month. And we're going to do it through this series called Created for Significance. And what I wanted to do was because most of you were not here 15 years ago. You've come since. And so many of you were not able to get in on the ground floor of what God did in my life to join in on it and get it going to see what it is today. But God has been good for 15 years. And my question is, as I approach this year, is what about the next 15? What's God got for the church at Creek Sin, as well as my life, for the next 15 years? Because as I look at my life, 15 years from now is about what I got left. And I want to finish strong. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about the journey that God took me on to get us to where we started and then where, again, we are today. Because I want all of you to know the heart of my heart and the heart of this church as well, so that the next 15 years we can get in on what God has for us as a church. And what happened 15 years ago actually started 16 years ago. Much like what Jesse talked about last week as he talked about making all things new in a new year, I had just come through a year that God began to deal with me about something new in my life. And it was about this time in 2003 that God began to deal with me. And I went on a personal retreat. I rented a room at Del Lago in Lake Conroe. Some of you may have heard of that down there. It wasn't far away, but it was far enough away to get away. And I just began to seek God on what this new thing was that he wanted to do in my life. And in my quiet time, I had been reading through the Gospels. And at this particular time in my life, I was in the middle of the Gospel of Luke. And up until that time, many of you know my background as a worship leader. I had been in ministry for, ever since I can remember. My dad, was a pastor, raised in church, and then I took on the mantle and I started doing worship leading. And as I looked at my skill set and what God had gifted me with and what God had created me to do and the education that I had a degree in music as well as a degree in ministry. I was doing what I felt God wanted me to do. And in fact, back in the early 90s, I had written out for myself a purpose statement. And I want to show you what my purpose statement was. This is 1991-ish, somewhere around in there. This was what guided my life, to ignite in people a passion to worship God. And that, in fact, I would tell you, if you've never written out a purpose statement for your life, to do it, because that gives you focus. It also helps you make good decisions, because if things don't fall within that purpose, you can say no to those things. And if something will enhance that purpose, you can say yes to some things. And it takes care of your focus so that you can really do what you were put on this earth to do. And that was my focus, was to ignite in people a passion to worship God, to train worship leaders, to have great worship experiences so that people could really experience the presence of God, not just on Sunday, but every day of the week as well. And I was pretty good at it. I was in a large church. I had a big choir. I had a big orchestra. In fact, I told people in the last service, which was not much smaller than this, that I had probably as many people in my choir as there are in this room. That's how big it was. And so I was having a great time doing what I was doing, but I was at this point now where God's saying to me, it's time for something new. And so as I got into the Gospel of Luke and I began to read it, when I left that hotel room, God gave me a new purpose statement. And that purpose statement was this: to ignite in people a passion to know and follow Christ. It was a little more focused on something a little bit different. And so what I want to do today is take you through what God showed me in these chapters in Luke to get to this place, to where he totally reworked my purpose statement. There are a couple of books that have influenced me, and maybe you've read them. They were bestsellers, but one was The Search for Significance, and the other was The Purpose-Driven Life. And as I was going through this, those books influencing me, as well as, the Gospel of Luke, this is what God showed me to do. And as we started a few months later, I'll tell you that in just a little bit, and got this group of people together of about a dozen families or so, I shared this with them. So some of you are hearing this for the first time. Some of you heard it the first time, and you have totally forgotten it because you've slept a lot since then. So I want to bring us back together after 15 years, and let's all get on the same page. Because here's what I've discovered. All of us, and we talk about this in our Meet Creeks In class a little bit, all of us want significance. We want to know that our lives have worth and that they have value. And our job, so to speak, as a church, we have discovered, is to help people find their worth, help people find their significance to God, and start that journey of following him from there. So here's what we're going to talk about today. To find that significance that we so long for, what we have to do is we have to align our purpose with God's purpose. If we want to find our worth, our significance, we have to align our purpose, whatever that was, to God's purpose, so that it's the same. Henry Blackaby said it this way: find out what God is doing and then get in on it with him. And that's what we have been doing for 15 years at Creeks In. It doesn't look like what we thought it would look like because we didn't really know what it would look like 15 years later. We had no idea. We just knew we needed to start somewhere. And that's what we did. But what we've discovered was there were pockets of places where God was moving, and we just got in on what he was doing so that we could help him do what he wanted to do. That's how we got started showing teacher appreciation. God opened a door. We began to get involved in that. And now, once a month, I don't know if you know this or not, once a month, we're in some elementary, middle school, or high school showing the teachers how much we appreciate them. We now have a mentoring program in 2 high schools. And we didn't know that was going to happen. We just saw God doing something, and we got in on it. We saw God working in Haiti. And we said, you know what? We want to help God do what he needs to do in Haiti. And so many of you were involved in that, in the missions to Corlove and helping the orphans. And we still do that. And now we think God's doing something in Northeast India. And we want to get in on it. And you'll be hearing about that in the weeks and months to come. But whatever it is, in order to find significance, we've got to find out how our purpose aligns with God's, because it has to align with God's. He has a purpose for each one of us. He has a purpose for us as a church. So I'm going to invite you in on that journey with me. It's a very personal story to me. And if you have a Bible, we're going to be in Luke chapter 14. That's where we're going to start. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to go over these 3 chapters, Luke 14, 15, and 16. We'll go through Luke 14 today. We'll spend a couple of weeks on Luke 15, which is probably my absolute favorite chapter in the Bible. And then the next couple of weeks we'll spend in Luke 16. So we're going to begin reading in Luke 14 with verse 1. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. So, you have a context here of Jesus basically, after church, has been invited over for lunch, which, by the way, I'm open to if you ever, want to do that. Anyway, it says this is not just any Pharisee. This is a prominent Pharisee. So this guy is very important, whoever he is. But as we'll see, there were some other Pharisees and religious leaders as well. And it says he was being carefully watched. Now, what does that mean? That means the Pharisees were always trying to find something on Jesus, some way to trap him, some way to discredit him, because people were following him instead of what they were doing and following their leadership and their religious rules and so forth. And so they were keeping an eye on him. So he was being carefully watched. And here's what happens in verse 2. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Now, most medical experts believe this was a condition known as edema. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a condition that's characterized by an excess of watery fluid collecting in the tissues and the cavities of the body. And it makes your body swell. It's very painful. And eventually it will kill you because it basically drowns you from the inside out. Edema. So there's this man in front of him suffering from edema. And Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts in the law, he says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Now remember, it's the Sabbath day. But they remained silent. So, taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. And then he asked them, if any one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? And the next verse says, and they had nothing to say. Now, one of the many rules that they had on the Sabbath was you couldn't work. You couldn't do anything on the Sabbath. Even dinner had to be prepared the day before. You could not do any work on the Sabbath. So Jesus looks at all these men. He looks down at the guy in need, and he says, okay, I get why you got me here today. This is a test. And you believe that it's wrong to do any kind of work on the Sabbath, including healing. And he's very mad, I think. That's what I'm reading in between the lines. He's angry because these guys obviously don't care one whit about this guy who's sick. They don't care that a family is about to be without a father. They don't care that he's in pain or the embarrassment he's now suffering as he stands in front of them all. He's just an object to be used to get to Jesus. So Jesus says, listen, I know what you're thinking. You all believe it's a sin to do good on a Sabbath, but you do good on the Sabbath if it suits your purpose. He says, if your son falls into a well, you don't say, oh, sorry, son, hope you're going to hold out till tomorrow. No. He says, you'll go and rescue your son from a well. He says, come on, guys, if your ox stumbles into a hole on the Sabbath day, you go get all your pulleys and winches and all the neighbors to come heft him out because you don't want it to suffer and because your economic prosperity is at stake. So you don't think it's right to do work on the Sabbath unless it suits your purpose. Now, we may not know what God's purpose is yet, but right here, you get a hint at what his purpose isn't. Write this down. God's purpose is not about rules. God's purpose is not about rules. He is far more interested in loving people than keeping rules. And I remember sitting in my hotel as I read this. And I remember reading that and saying, you go get them, Jesus. That's what I'm talking about. But then I felt God's Spirit dealing with me. And it was at this point where I basically just heard this inner voice saying, Bobby, find yourself in this story. Find yourself in this story. So I kind of just mentally imagined the scene. It's a Sabbath day. Jesus gets invited to a party, and as he strolls up to the front walk, he notices that all the other guests have arrived early. Kind of like when you have a surprise birthday party, you tell everybody to get there at 6, and then the guest of honor at 6:30. So he strolls up and he realizes something not right here. And instead of everybody being huddled inside the house getting ready to eat, they're all out on the front yard. And as I imagined it, I imagined all these Pharisees and religious leaders in a semicircle. And there in front of them was this poor guy in pain, obviously doesn't belong there, probably a totally different social class as the rest of them. And upon closer inspection, Jesus notices that his legs, his arms, his neck, his cheek, they're all swollen, and he's in pain, and he's probably has tissue damage, and probably has weeks, months to live. I mean, can you see that in your mind? Can you picture that like I did? Kind of like a football huddle. The quarterback's in one place and they're gathered up around him to call the next play. And God said to me, find yourself in this picture. So, I said, okay, I'm certainly not Jesus. We can rule that out. I don't think I'm the man who's sick, because if that's a condition of someone who needs healing, I don't think I need healing right now. That only left me with one other group. And that was the guy standing in the back with robes on, a Pharisee. And I thought, seriously? Am I the Pharisee in this story? These Pharisees, they were highly educated. They were devoutly spiritual types. They had positions of responsibility within the religious community. They spent years reading the Old Testament, which was their Bible of the day. They knew most of it by heart. And they knew all the rules and regulations, and they tried their best to live their lives by the laws. And they thought anyone else who didn't do it, they were a little less than them. And I looked at that picture, and it was like God was just saying to me, Bobby, that's you. You're a Pharisee. And I had to admit, he was right. I was a religious leader. I studied the book. I knew the rules, tried my best to abide by them. I even knew the rules that weren't in the book, like don't smoke, dance, or chew, or go with girls who do. I knew those rules too. And I sat there in stunned silence. And then I read some more. Verse 7. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. So Jesus heals the man, sends him on his way, and now they move inside to eat. And Jesus decides to tell them this story. He says, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. And if so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, God had my full attention now as I was reading this story, so I was thinking about what do Pharisees typically do at public gatherings? And in every line of work, there is social posturing. You find it like, for instance, in the Marines. In the Marines, you know quite clearly who the ranking officers are. And you know who the junior officers are. In a corporation, you know who the presidents and the vice presidents and the CEOs are, and then you know who sweeps the floors when the lights go out. You find it in a hen house, where everybody knows who the head rooster is, right? It's called the pecking order. The pecking order. Now, in my line of work, it's a little more subtle, because pastors are supposed to be a little more godly and humble, and so we don't blatantly differentiate ourselves. But at every pastor's conference that I would attend, one of the big questions always was asked of me, well, how big is your church? Hey, have you written any books? As if to say you get extra points for that. And it's not near as blatant. In Jesus' day, the pecking order was more blatant. The more important you were, the closer you sat to the host. And Jesus, he's still worked from this charade he's witnessed outside. He decides that while he's giving lessons on doing good, that he's going to give some lessons on how to act at a party as well. And so he says, look, don't seek the best seat. Seek the place of humility and then let God exalt you when it's appropriate. And it was this part of the passage where God just knocked the smugness out from me. I was a worship leader, as I told you, at a church, had over 1,000 people. Our worship and music ministry was recognized as one of the top 50 in the country. I mean, I felt pretty good about that. And whenever I got together with other worship pastors, it was like, my church was almost always bigger. And so I almost always got the best seat, so to speak. And God just said, Bobby, is this what you're living for? The best seat? It hadn't started out that way. When I surrendered to ministry 40 years ago, I just wanted to serve God, love his church. But it's so easy to let your purpose get fuzzy and get out of line with God's purpose as you seek your own seat at the table. So God was rattling my chain. I read on, verse 12. Then Jesus said to the host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or your sisters, your relatives or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But, verse 13, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, Jesus is thinking to himself, okay, while I'm on a roll, I might as well tell them not just where to sit at the party, but how to throw a party. And he says, when you throw a party, don't invite all the nice, safe, beautiful, cleaned up people who are already a part of your social circle. Instead, when you throw a party, use the opportunity to invite some not so cleaned up people. People who don't know how to throw parties. If you do that, Jesus said, God will be pleased because that's the kind of party he throws. He's looking for people to bless who are willing to invite outsiders to the party, and that's when it hit me. God's purpose is not about rules. It's about people. It's about people. He's not into rules, he's into loving people. And if that is his purpose, then in order to find significance, I need to align my purpose with that. My purpose needs to be about people. And as I was sitting and reading that in my hotel room, I was thinking about the people who attended the party every weekend that we threw at church. And you know what? You know who attended that party? The cleaned up, already convinced Christians. That's who was at the party. In fact, all the visitors who showed up were already nice, safe, cleaned up Christians. No seekers were even invited to the party. And I sat there for several minutes, not knowing what to do next. And God said, you're a Pharisee. Your purpose in life has gotten out of alignment. And that's when I finally just realized, I think I'm a Pharisee and I'm involved in a church who doesn't know what the party's for. And I have forgotten what the party's for. So I just said a real simple prayer at that moment. I said, God, I'm sorry for living this way. I don't know what to do, but I want you to change me. And friends, that prayer was the initial push that made my alignment, my purpose, fall back in line with God's. And eventually take the role I have now today. And in the initial core building stage, when we were meeting at that little clubhouse in Northampton, in the back of Northampton, and talking about what this was going to look like and what we needed to do, I remember as I shared this with them, this group, we all agreed that whatever happened to us, we didn't want to become Pharisees. We didn't want to become about rules. We wanted to become about people and be a part of a church where we didn't want to be a part of a church where status took precedence over humility. And we would never again be willing to be a part of a church that invited only the already convinced to the party. So as we get ready for the next 15 years of our church's history, I'm praying for you to embrace those same convictions with me. Would you be willing to pray that same prayer that I prayed? God, would you change me? Would you align my purpose with yours? It's a powerful prayer. Well, the rest of Jesus' experience at that Sabbath dinner is contained in a story that he told just before the meal was over. And we learn even more about his purpose in this next section. In verse 15, it says, when one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Now that may seem a little random to you, but for the first century Jew, just the mention of a banquet, like Jesus is mentioned in this story, just the mention brought on thoughts of heaven. Because there was a prophecy in the Old Testament where the Bible describes this banquet that's going to take place in heaven. And all the Jewish people anticipated this. It's in Isaiah 25. I want to put the verses up. You don't have to look it up, but I want to put it on the screen. It says this. This is what he was referring to. On the mountain of the Lord Almighty, on this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best meats and the finest of wines. And on this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, and he will remove the disgrace of his people from all the earth. That's what came into the mind of this Pharisee when Jesus mentions the word banquet. And for those of you who are Christ followers, by the way, I'll throw this in. If you go to the book of Revelation, there's a very similar picture that's going to happen. We're going to have a party when this is over. And that's what came to this guy's mind. And when you translate it for this guy, it meant this guy was saying, I want to be at that party. But Jesus still a little agitated because of what's been happening. So he tells this story in verse 16. Jesus replied, a certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, I've just bought a field and I must go see it. Please excuse me. Another said, I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. Still another said, I just got married, so I can't come. Verse 21, the servant came back and reported this to his master, and then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town, bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Well, sir, the servant said, what you ordered has been done, but there is still room. Then the master told his servant, go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. Verse 24, I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet. Now, it's a very colorful story, but it takes on a whole lot more color if you know just a few things about first century banquets. One of which is only important people, only noblemen, threw banquets. Commoners, you may have a few friends over for a snack or lunch or something, but only those of importance would throw a banquet. Another thing is to know that RSVPs were very important. When you got an invitation to a banquet, it was important because the process of butchering and then roasting the meat was so time-consuming, and because there was no refrigeration, a party giver could only cook as much meat as the guests that were going to come. So, the type of meat served at a banquet was actually chosen after the number of guests had responded to the invitation. And this is interesting. Julia Childs did some research, and she discovered in first century what the formula was for a banquet. Marcos, you might find this interesting. My son-in-law's a chef, in case you didn't know. Here's the formula, according to Julia Childs. 2 to 4 people, chicken. 5 to 8, duck. 10 to 15, goat. 15 to 35, lamb. 35 to 75, beef. Now, I don't know about you. If I'd have lived in that day, I don't want to go to a gathering of 10 to 15 people. Smaller or larger, I do not want goat, okay? But you can see from this how important the invitation was. If you accepted the invitation, that meant you were coming. And that's what the host would prepare for. Now, I know this way some of you RSVP. Think about that. Next time you have an RSVP, the polite thing to do is respond one way or another. But this was important because that was only the first invitation. The first invitation was to find out how many were coming. The second invitation was to tell you when it was ready to come eat. That's how they did things around there. Every person around the table that day, they understood what Jesus was talking about. They knew what the first invitation was. They knew what the second invitation was. So when Jesus describes the people who renege on the invitation, this is what really gets interesting. There were 3 guys that this servant went to. One was the guy who said, I just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me. Now, one scholar commenting on that particular statement said this is a bold-faced lie and everybody knows it. And it is. No one buys a field in the Middle East without knowing every square foot of it. In fact, they know everything about it. They know the springs, the wells, the walls, the history of who owned it. Every single thing about a piece of the field was known before a purchase price was ever even discussed. And the fields in the Middle East were so important, they named them just like we name our pets. So what Jesus is describing in this story is that when the servant comes to say, hey, dinner's ready, we'll be right there, the landowner says, you know what, I'm sorry, but I have dirt that's more important than you are. And he insults the host by blatantly lying. And the servant goes to a second home, and at this home the guy says, I can't come either. And his response is, I just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me. In the Greek, that means lie. There were 2 ways of selling oxen in the first century. One, you took it to the marketplace, and there was a field out nearby. You let everybody know, hey, I'm selling oxen. And by the way, a yoke of oxen was 2 oxen. Okay, and they were teamed together so that they could work together to plow. You would do a demonstration out in that field. And so you could watch and see how those oxen worked together. And if they didn't work together well, you weren't going to purchase those oxen. Another way of selling them was that you had a field at your house, and you told everybody, hey, I've got some oxen to sell. I'm going to be at this time of day plowing. You can come watch and see how they do, and then you can go and see if you want to buy them or not. Now, do you remember how many yoke of oxen this guy said he bought? 5. Now, he says, I'm sorry, I can't come. I bought 5 yokes of oxen. I'm on my way to try them out. You would never buy oxen unseen. Would you buy 5 used cars unseen? That's basically what he's doing. I'm buying 5 used cars, and now I'm going to go test drive them. Isn't that crazy? And that insult is even worse than the first, because land was considered precious, whereas oxen were considered unclean. And this guy's basically saying these unclean animals are more important to me than you are. The third excuse giver says this: I just got married, so I can't come. Now you would think, well, yeah, I understand that, right? I get it. But he doesn't even say, please excuse me. And everybody around that table knows, well, that's a lie. You would never have a wedding feast the same time as a banquet, because nobody's going to come to your banquet. They're all going to go to the wedding feast, because the wedding involved the whole village. And weddings were planned a year in advance. And they're thinking, this guy, he's just a liar. No one would ever do that. And in Jesus' story, the great man who's in charge of the party says this: fine, insult me if you want to, but I'm still holding my party. I'm still having my banquet. And he sends his servant to find hurting and needy people to come to eat what he's prepared, however many that was that responded to that first invitation. So the servant rounds up all the street people, and there's still room for more people. So the master opens up the party to people outside the city, out in the country roads and such. And when Jesus describes this part of the story, what his hearers heard was, God even rounded up the riffraff of Israel, and even the Gentiles were invited to this party. And here is what God showed me about his purpose. Are you ready? God's purpose is about getting people to the party. His purpose is about getting people to the party, not about rules. It's about people and getting those people to the party, getting those people to heaven. And what Jesus was saying to those religious leaders was, some of you are going to reject God's offer of a banquet in heaven. And you can do that if you want to, but know that it's going to be very insulting to him, because he will see through every excuse that you offer. And God will fill heaven with or without you. Because I'm going to have my party whether you come or not. He's on a mission to fill heaven. That's his purpose. And he's going to do it with or without you and me. So if God's purpose is not about rules but about people, and if God's purpose is about getting people to the party, then we have to align our purpose with God's purpose. That needs to be our purpose. That's the only way we're going to find significance and worth, is to align our purpose with God's. See, I had a very safe and comfortable existence 16 years ago in a very safe and comfortable church. But from what I just read, I knew God wanted more. He wanted more of me, and I believe God wants more of you. And I didn't know it that day, but months later, I found myself putting my house on the market, gathering my younger kids who were still in school, talking about what was going to happen, and eventually, the Church of Creeksend was born. The New Testament teaches that God loved the world so much that he gave his life for you and me, but in the book of Acts, it talks about how he gave his life for the church. The church is the only hope for the world, people. And if we're Christ followers, we are part of the church. And God has a mission to get people to the party, and that should be our mission as a church. That should be my mission as an individual. And you don't have to be a pastor to do that. You can teach, you can practice law, you can put out fires, you can protect our country, you can do all of that and still align your purpose with God's and invite people to the party. Because that's what his purpose is. So here's what I'm asking you. And we're just beginning, by the way. This is just the first Sunday. I'm inviting you to join me, because I'm going back to that time, and I'm going to rededicate myself to that purpose. As we think about the next 15 years, I'm going to invite you to join me. And if you'll stick with me through this series, I think you'll better understand the heart of our church. But you'll also better understand your part in being a part of this church. That's my prayer. But it starts with one small but powerful prayer. God, change me. So I want to ask us